Good afternoon. Welcome to today's session. We are continuing with the theme Rethinking Development. And this afternoon, our topic for discussion is making the multicolor deal a reality. My name is Masego Madzwamuse. I'm with the Southern Africa Trust. African feminist based here in South Africa. I will be co-facilitating this session together with Gabriela Mendes. And I'd love to invite Gabriela to please introduce herself briefly.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from Brazil. I'm very excited. We're reaching the last day of our festival. I'm an economist, feminist from Latin America, and I'm really happy with this panel. We have two amazing guests that Masego will present.
Awesome, Gabriela, thank you. You are absolutely right. We've got two amazing guests with us, and I think we couldn't have asked for a better panel to close us off, being the last day, to really close us off on a positive note, in the sense that helping us to really unpack the problems of our times, but to also leave us with a vision of what a possible future could look like from feminist perspectives. I've got with me Jayati Ghosh, and Jayati taught economics at I'm going to get this so terribly wrong. Jawahal.
Just say Nehru. Just say Nehru.
Nehru University in New Delhi. Thank you for saving the day. And she's taught economics for nearly 35 years. And from January 2021, she joined the University of Massachusetts in the US, and she has authored and edited 19 books, including Never Done and Poorly Paid, looking at women's work in globalizing India, very relevant for what we've been discussing. Women Unlimited in New Delhi, co-edited Elgar Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development, Demonetization Decoded, and lots of other fabulous titles. I think what really comes out beautifully from Jayati's profile is what plays into what we've been discussing all along, which is what are the alternatives, looking and considering that the current social and economic system has completely failed us. And most recently, Jayati wrote an interesting article commenting on this whole notion of the Green Deal, where she said, in fact, what we need is not just a Green Deal, but a multi-colour deal. And the title of that paper inspired the title of this session. We really look forward to hearing a bit more about that from you when we get to that. We're honored that you're here with us. And from the Caribbean, we're joined by Tonya Hayen. I hope I'm getting that right, Tonya. And if I'm not, Haynes, you will correct me when you introduce yourself. But Tonya is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies. She's the first graduate of the doctoral program of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit, representing a new generation of homegrown Caribbean feminist scholars. We like that. Her research is animated by the liberatory potential of Caribbean feminist thought. And we really look forward to soaking in your brilliance and sharing insights from the feminist Caribbean social thought. But now going back, I'm going to start by inviting Jayati to really just start, and you've already said to us you only have an hour with us, and we're hoping we can maximize on that time that you have with us. And to just start by sharing with us your ideas of this multicolored new deal, multicolored new global deal for a post-pandemic world, and why those ideas are relevant for rethinking development. Over to you, Jayati.
Thank you so much, Masego and Gabriela, Tanya. It's really wonderful to be part of this. I feel so privileged to be part of this very exciting discussion among, young feminists. It really makes me feel good about the future in a time when you have to search for things to feel good about. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for giving us all hope, those of us who are leaving you a really terrible world to negotiate. Yes, so let me just explain very briefly what I mean by this multicolored global New Deal. A lot of talk has been going on about a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal. It's in the United States and the United Kingdom, even in global discussions. But the green essentially relates to climate change and the need to deal with it, and how we have to get on board immediately to address the problems of the climate as we address the problems of the pandemic. That's absolutely true. But we really need to expand that notion of what we need to do in terms of going forward, how we want to change our economies and societies. And so I've argued it has to be multicolored. And what are the colors I've identified? You can probably think of others as well. Definitely it has to be green in terms of climate change and other aspects of forests and other things that we are destroying. But it also has to be blue in terms of water. I think it's a hugely ignored topic. I know in my own region in South Asia, it's a very, very major issue. A lot of the wars of this century are going to be about water. I imagine a lot of this is true in Africa and parts of Latin America as well. So we have to also be blue in our thinking. We have to be purple. Purple, as you all probably know, is the color of the care economy. And if anything has come out clearly in the pandemic, it is how crucial the care economy is, not just for the welfare of society, but the very sustainability and resilience of the economy. We've seen how underinvestment in health destroyed the capacity of countries to deal with a pandemic, and how this is actually just going to get worse and worse. So purple, absolutely, it has to be. And it has to be red for redistribution. I'm still one of those. My generation still thinks of red as that kind of color. And it has to be red because we thought we had reached the pinnacle of inequality in 2008. Then 10 years later, we were even worse. Then we thought pre-pandemic, we have reached the pinnacle of inequality. And hey, guess what? It's got even worse. So we are scaling new heights of inequality in ways which are making our societies dysfunctional. So we clearly have to do something about it. And it has to be global. I'm going to come back to why it has to be global when I explain what this New Deal means. And I think that's very important in terms of how we operationalize it. The old New Deal that people talk about, what's this word New Deal? It comes from President Roosevelt in the United States in the middle of the Great Depression. He announced a New Deal which had certain elements which, let's face it, actually transformed the US economy. And a lot of things that people take for granted in the United States today, many of the universities, many of the libraries, the nature of public schooling, the nature of public transport, all of these actually emerged out of that New Deal. But there were three important elements which are very relevant for today. One of them is recovery. Recovery based on massive public spending. In the United States, they doubled the entire government budget in just 3 years. I mean, that's the kind of increase in public spending you got. Huge increases in public spending directed to all kinds of things: infrastructure, social protection, employment benefit, schooling, housing, you name it. There were things done, huge, massive, massive increases in public spending. In our case, we will need to do it to address all these colors that I've been talking about: the ecology, water, care, etc. Okay, social protection, public services. The second major element of the New Deal was regulation. And we cannot forget that. That's so important. Regulate capital markets, regulate finance, regulate labor markets, regulate environment. Don't allow private companies to do what they like. in particular situations, destroy nature, desecrate the environment, and so on. So regulation was a critical feature, absolutely essential feature of that New Deal. And the third huge element was redistribution, which happens in many different ways. It happens through establishing a minimum wage, raising it in accordance with the cost of living, ensuring universal public services for everyone, so that people don't have to pay huge amounts for basic health, basic education, basic housing, basic electricity, basic bandwidth, which is now a need, etc. Paying for that by taxing the rich. You know, the marginal tax rate in Roosevelt, I mean, it went up to 90% in the United States. The first major tax cut of the 70s brought it down to 70%. The next major tax cut of the Reagan years brought it down to 50%. Now we are talking about tax rates of anything between 12 to 24%. I mean, ridiculous on capital. And on the super rich, well, they get away with paying no tax at all because they can move their money around. There are ways of making multinationals pay their fair share of tax, even at the low rate. At the moment, they get away with nothing. Google, Amazon, etc. There are ways of making sure the rich cannot just move their money around by having a global asset register so everybody knows whose money is where. These are things that are possible if governments can be forced to share information. And so it can be done if there's political will. All of these things are not impossible. They're not crazy utopian ideas. They've been done before. We can force our governments to do it again with enough sufficient political pressure. So I'm so excited that all of you are doing this because I really think these are the seeds of that kind of political pressure. And I think, as I said, it can be done. And you people are the ones who can do it.
Pressure, pressure, pressure. Indeed, we're the ones we've been waiting for. I think you make some really good points. I want to bring my co-facilitator in here, Gabriella, to check if she's got any follow-up questions for you at this point before we bring in Tonya. Gabriella?
Hey, I'm so happy to hear Professor Jayati. I think we live in a moment of crisis where other perspective, we like coming to a vision of world. It seems like we have no exit, and this contribution is really important, especially when it comes of the we must to regulate the markets and about the payment of discount because very often they use the no money, the terrorism, to say that we cannot make these adjustments. So it's really important to think about how, in an international perspective, who must you pay this account, which is really important. I believe, let's hear, I have a lot of questions, but I think let's hear Tonya. I'm very excited to hear you, and then we go for the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Tonya, I think this is a good point to bring you in, indeed. And what Jayati framed for us as the new multicolored deal and the importance of it. And she says, you know, she actually does talk about the governance failure and that those who've got vested interest are not going to deliver this deal for us, but we have to be at the driving force. And while you comment on what Jayati has just shared with us, perhaps you can also share with us what feminist contributions have been coming out of the Caribbean. I think similar to what we're seeing in the African continent, just reflecting on both the climate crisis, particularly the climate crisis, if we were to reflect on that, is this whole notion that we face the brunt of the crisis, but we've done very little to contribute towards the high level carbon emissions, and it, you know, so it's in our best interest that something progressive is done to deal with the crisis that is at hand. But how do we change that narrative from really just talking about how vulnerable we are and how we're facing the brunt to forging a vision that begins to put forward some of the solutions that we need to see.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Masejo. Thank you, Gabriela. Professor Jayati, thanks to all the organizers for inviting me here. It is a sincere privilege to be part of this conversation and also to have read Professor Jayati's work and to listen to her opening and framing remarks. And I think in many ways, there are a lot of synergies with what she expressed and with what feminists from the Caribbean, the sort of thinking that is coming from feminists from the Caribbean and also from the broader global South. And I wanted to start in particular with a quote that I think by Sylvia Wynter, who is a Jamaican intellectual, the Caribbean's most important living intellectual, but also she was a dancer, a creative writer. And I think this is the kind of thinking that we need. And she starts by saying the tremendous transformation of global warming and climate change has enabled us to see that as long as we continue to all want to be good men and women of the Western bourgeois kind, wherever we are in the world, we will destroy the world. We'll destroy the planetary environment and therefore our only possible habitat as a species. And for me, I start with this quote from her as a framing remark, because for us, the climate crisis is an existential crisis, especially for small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. But because they connect, it connects the climate crisis to the interlocking crises that Professor Jayati has mentioned, for example. So the fact that this assault on the planet is very much related to a particular economic model and an economic model that we then also incorporate as our way of understanding ourselves in the world, and the way in which that is related to unequal relations of gender, to a very binary understanding of gender, that when she talks about wanting to be a good woman and a good man of the Western bourgeois kind, so in a way that forecloses on other possibilities for gender self-determination. So I want us to understand very clearly that, the climate crisis is a crisis of our own understanding of what development is and what it should look like, of unsustainable levels of consumption and production, but also the way in which everybody is expected to incorporate this as their way of being in the world. This equation of being human with being this consuming, self-interested individual. And also thinking about how that is gendered, but very much linked to histories of colonization, of racism, and of imperialist extraction across the global South. And so particularly for us in the Caribbean, when we think about this notion of a modern Caribbean and the way in which it has its roots in the enslavement of Africans in the Americas. And so for me, it is important that we are also doing that looking back at understanding the roots of where this particular understanding of what it means to be human has come from, and how it is very much related to the climate crisis, but also to the health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is the ways in which we are living, the destruction of our forests, of the habitats of other species with which we share the planet, that is allowing these viruses to leap to the human population. So we have to bear that in mind. And of course, that question of being a good man or a good woman of the Western bourgeois kind leads us to thinking, as Professor Jayati centered, this question about care and the care economy and the kind of crisis in care that has been provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic, the way in which we have now realized that a lot of the very undervalued and devalued work has now come to be deemed as essential, and the ways in which women's labor in particular is required for, and drawn upon and hyper exploited now as a means of responding to the crisis, even as Masejo, you rightly pointed out, the ways in which we are often not at the decision making in terms, whether it is thinking about global south countries or thinking about the particular contributions of women or of trans people, of queer people at the decision making, but really on the front lines of feeling the effects. And so for me, in terms of a collective thinking that comes from the Caribbean, that also comes from the global South, and that has been, I think, well developed for quite some time, is around the need to rethink what exactly we mean by development. We've seen unprecedented economic growth, and that wealth has completely been captured by elites, to the extent that, they're wealthier in some cases than entire countries. Right? We have seen the rising inequalities within, but also between countries. And we understand the structural inequalities even within institutions that are supposed to be global and multilateral, but are actually engineered to promote and represent the interests of the global north. So for me, I think as we move towards thinking about solutions, for me, I am seeing with global supply chains disrupted by COVID-19, we see the need for to promote local economies and also regional economies, to build economies that are, and especially coming from a region where all of our production has been about, not about us, but about the outside, right? About the of labor and resources for somebody else to accumulate wealth, that we need to have economies that are for ourselves, and that center things like food production. So there are Caribbean countries with no domestic food production, which and that are also heavily tourism dependent. So anywhere from 20% to 66% of GDP dependent on tourism at a time when, pretty much tourism now is dead because of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The reduction of global air travel is over 80%. And also anybody who would want to go on holiday during a pandemic is perhaps not the kind of traveler that you want anyway. So all of these things for us reveal in a very, a way that is very felt, the fact that we have to, our very survival requires this reimagining and rethinking what development means, and thinking about, food security and food systems that are not linked to global supply chains, which can be disrupted at a moment's notice. And also that we have this corporatization of development, the way is something that I think we have to be very careful about. We have to be careful about this kind of corporate takeover of education and other kinds of public goods that can be engineered precisely because of the pandemic. And the way in which this corporatization of development means that corporations are the main beneficiaries of development. And that when they invest in the global south, for example, they're often investing in the existing inequalities there and not working to transform them. So, for me, it was very important to read Jayati's thinking around the ways in which we have to reposition care, the environment, and thinking about climate resilience and building resilience, and also a much larger macroeconomic framework in which we rethink and reposition what we understand and mean by development.
Tanya, thank you. I just let you go on there for a little bit longer because you're sharing such deep insights, and I was enjoying listening to what you were saying there. The important point that you make around the climate crisis being a crisis of how we understand and how we have been practicing development, I think is a critical one. And the links that you make between the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic. And I think a lot has been said about how this signals a collapse of systems. This is if there's an ultimate thing that we want to be able to show us, that these are two sides of one coin, where there's a singular message there that says there is a total collapse of the very systems that human well-being, livelihoods, economies and ecosystems depend on. This is what we're seeing as a signal, as a signal to all of us. And we are joined by Beatrice Makwenda from the Rural Women's Assembly. While I let her settle down, I want to go back to Professor Jayati and just pick up on some of the ideas that you've previously shared. I mean, one of the things that you do say is that a lot of the policy responses that we're seeing at the global level, at the country level, including in India as an example, are short of ambition. And they just tend to be like tinkering on the margins, pushing business as usual. And what we need to see is something that spurs us towards sustainable recovery. And we cannot look to the same people who have a shortage of ambition for answers. The question for you is, what are you seeing emerging as contributions from South feminists, yourself and others around you, around resolving this current crisis? Are we represented in the spaces where solutions are being forged, where ideas are being shared or ideas are being formulated? And how do we go about just really strengthening the South feminist presence? Because I think, like I said at the beginning, we're the ones who've been waiting for. We have no shortage of ideas and ambitious ones for that matter. Yeah. Professor Jayati?
Wow, Masego, tough questions, huh? How do we, so I think this is the critical point here, is that we have to function on many levels, because the thing we're dealing with is also hydra-headed and at many levels. We have to function within our countries, nationally, and even locally, okay, to actually contest the kinds of decisions that are made. But we also have to be international. And that's why I'm so glad that you are really already thinking internationally in scope, because many of those things are not even possible with the most well-meaning government. So let me begin with my first axiom. Most governments, even the most well-meaning, will not do something unless they're pushed. So one of our jobs, I think, is to create the knowledge, awareness, and mobilization in societies to push governments, to make certain demands inevitable and impossible to ignore. And that means we have to form coalitions. We can't just say, well, we are only feminists, we will not talk to farmers, or we will not talk to those trade unions because we knew that they were terrible, masochistic, macho bastards, etc. Excuse my language, but you get the point. We have to be willing to align with all kinds of people, because the threats we face are so multidimensional. We cannot say we're really pure and we're perfect because we have all the right ideas and we will not deal with X and Y. So we have to build coalitions. We have to build coalitions within our countries. We have to build across borders. One of the things I wanted to mention and I didn't get onto is about how it has to be global, this multicolored New Deal. Why? Because currently the global architecture doesn't allow us to do all the things that we would like to do. The recovery, the regulation, the redistribution. And there are 5 particular things which we have to immediately address, okay? One of them is the whole issue of sovereign debt, how it's treated, how corporates get away with murder in terms of getting their debt written off, especially big multinationals, but governments do not. And that means that citizens end up paying because it cuts down on government resources and forces us. So we have to have measures to deal with sovereign debt, which allows for significant debt write-off because many of these debts are now unpayable. The second is tax cooperation. all governments are losing huge amounts to multinational corporations who are doing what they call base erosion. Basically, they shift their profits to low tax jurisdictions, which are not, by the way, just necessarily Caribbean islands who get all the flack. Which are the biggest tax havens? The United Kingdom, with its Guernsey and Jersey. United States, with states like Delaware, where Joe Biden comes from. The Netherlands, which is a major tax haven. Ireland, these are the big tax havens in the world. And these are the reasons why companies like Amazon, et cetera, don't pay any taxes practically. So tax cooperation, absolutely essential. All of us lose out. Citizens across the world lose out, but in developing countries, it matters much more because we really need those resources, not just for our development project, just to give basic needs to our people. The third big thing, intellectual property rights. You know, it's becoming so clear in the pandemic. All these big drug companies that are falling over themselves to come out to be the first with the vaccine and so on, all are using these patents and they're not willing to share. There was something in the WTO, a measure that was moved by, I think, 7 developing country governments to waive the patents on drugs during the pandemic. The COVID-19 vaccines and related drugs, waive the patents on that during this pandemic. You should look at the map of the countries that supported it and the countries that opposed it. And if you think there's no North-South divide, well, it's entirely driven by the North opposing it, the North including Australia and New Zealand, and the South in favor. And that's not because this will benefit citizens of the North, but it's the multinational drug lobbies that have huge influence with those governments. So, you know, that's another area where you really need popular pressure to force these governments to change. Cross-border financial flows. Look at how we've been buffeted, developing countries. And I mean, the minute something happens, money rushes out. And then suddenly they ease monetary policy in the North and money rushes in again. And so we're just driven crazy by all these flows, which then give us major macroeconomic problems that we cannot control. And finally, deindustrialization through trade. We have to think of ways in which we can promote without being protectionist in a narrow nationalist and stupid way, but we have to promote our development. We have to promote diversification. So we have to think of trade and industrial policies that will allow women workers as well to get decent jobs. So there's a global framework that we need to promote this deal. It doesn't mean we can't do it without, but we certainly need that. So it means we have to be fighting on all these levels, the local, the national, the international. And so we need as many alliances as we can get.
Thank you, Professor. I have now 2 questions. One question is for Tonya and another one for Jayati. Tonya, thinking about these levels that we must to look for the fighting, the local, the national, and the international, I want to understand with you, how do you think we can fight with the food problem we have? And this crisis of COVID has shown how deep is this problem. Here in Brazil also, we see the increasing of the prices of the food because the North is consuming everything. So what are the exits that you see for this problem, which is a structural problem? It's a big challenge. And after that, I want to understand with Professor Jayati, now the public debits are one of the biggest arguments they use to avoid the advance of policies that will benefit the people that need. So I want to understand how must we face between this argument that the state has no money, the state is broke, there's no money. And also, I want to understand if the fight for the regulation of the markets, is that an anti-capitalist agenda? So when we fight to regulate the markets and to impose some rules, is that also, is that still an anti-capitalist agenda? So Tonya, please start, and then Mr. Jayati.
Thank you so much for your question, Gabriela, around food security. I think that this has always been an issue, but the pandemic, the disruption of global supply chains, the way in which food has become a lot more expensive, but also I think the health component of it, and particularly around things like diabetes and hypertension, which are the healthcare crises that a lot of parts of the global south were facing prior to the COVID pandemic, and that are absolutely linked, particularly in the Americas, to histories of slavery and colonization, but also the ways in which the colonial relationships continued in the post-independence period, and that those continued, and our relationship to food and to food production, quite frankly, many parts of the Caribbean, as I mentioned, there is no domestic food production. Food is imported. It comes on in containers from Miami, and it is very expensive, processed, and unhealthful. But you also have the situation where globally, a lot of that sort of what is called subsistence agriculture is done primarily by women who face discrimination in access to land and to inputs, and whose the contribution that they're making to the entire country's economy is not viewed as such. And so there is no support for the kind of work that women do in agriculture. And so for me, that food sovereignty question is a justice question. It is a health justice question. It is a gender justice question. And I think our options are around, the sort of solutions have to be embedded within a larger framework of how we are rethinking and rethinking development, repositioning care and the care economy, centering questions of gender justice in there, and also questions of the ongoing inequalities between countries. So for me, solutions to that are embedded within this larger conversation that we have been having around how we address climate crisis, economic crisis, health crises, see them as interlocking and very much related to persistent structural inequalities of race, and also gender, and inequalities between the North and South.
Thank you so much, Tonya. Now, Jayati, if you can answer the big question I made to
you. Yes, you guys ask really tough questions. By the way, I noticed that there was a question in the question box about what should the color of reparations be? And that's a very good one, but I would say black, obviously. Right? I mean, look at the history of slavery. Look at the whole, extraction of resources from the colonies. I mean, clearly, black is the color of reparations. And yes, we definitely add that to our list. Big questions. The first one, the state has no money. So, it's so interesting. This is such a political statement because obviously they have money whenever they need it, right? Look at the developed world. All this time after the global crisis, we were told, oh, listen, it has to be only monetary policy. You cannot do fiscal policy because the state has no money. We kept hearing that, right? From the US, UK, Canada, Europe, everybody. You get the pandemic, the big companies collapse. Suddenly the state has money. We are talking about fiscal spending of between 10 to 25% of GDP. Suddenly, in 6 months, they have this money. Where did this money come from that they didn't have before, right? It's purely political. Let's face it, a state is not a household. It doesn't really need to go even and borrow from a bank. It can borrow from the central bank, which means printing money. It can do that. That's what states do. A state can always spend money. The idea that a state has to wait till tax money comes in and then it goes out and spends it like, a householder, that's complete nonsense. States first spend. They first spend. That's what they do. Sometimes it's book transactions. Sometimes it's more borrowing from the central bank. They print money, whatever. States spend money, and then that generates economic activity that brings them tax revenues. And then at the end of it, you get a deficit. So this whole idea that the state has no money, that's complete nonsense. That's political. And you will find that they have money when it comes to giving subsidies to cronies, when it comes to, some big vanity project, they suddenly have the money. In India too, they have no money for health, for paying care workers, for basic facilities. They have money for a big statue. They have money to undo the existing parliament and break it down and build a new one. Suddenly they have money for all of that. So it's a purely political point. The second one is the regulation of markets and anti-capitalist agenda. Yes, absolutely. Okay, now here is the thing. I'm very old, right? So I've been part of a group that keeps seeing the decline of the final crisis of capitalism. We've seen it many times, and unfortunately, it is never the final one, right? They keep recovering and coming back. But the point is, anything that chips away from what we have now revolution is not an event, it's a process. Okay? And so you have to do the things that chip away and generate change. Let's face it, today, global capitalism, in a way, it's dead. It's got no dynamism. It's got no ability to generate new growth and investment. It's not doing any of the things that, say, Marx thought capitalism would do. It no longer has that capacity, right? So it's dead. The trouble is there's nobody to move that bloody dead body out of the way. It's lying like a shroud on top of us. We have to actually begin to eliminate it. Why is it dead? Because it was too successful in eliminating everything that could control it. Trade unions, people's associations, any kind of regulation, it got rid of all of that. We have to bring that back. So yes, regulation is very much an anti-capitalist agenda. And okay, some people will say it is also saving capitalism from the capitalists. But I'm not so sure about that. I think, as I said, I told you, I think revolution is a process.
Wow. I've got like so many questions that are coming in, through my mind as you were talking, and just trying to distill what both you and Tonya have said, and just putting it in the context of trying to imagine what an anti-capitalist and anti-racist development agenda would look like. There's certain things that you said which really resonate, and I like that, and I like that in the vision of this multicolored deal. There's a color that we add, and so apt that we add black being the color of reparations. But there's also something that you've said, which I think it's a preoccupation for a lot of South feminists in this moment, which is really around how to position ourselves to share these great ideas, great insights, and visions for a possible future going forward. One of the things that you said, Professor Jayati, only because you might be leaving us soon, is you said transformation happens. You said we need to form coalitions, right? And be willing to align ourselves with people of all kinds. And it got me thinking about how transformation happens, that sometimes transformation happens when the least likely allies come together, which is a very uncomfortable conversation to have. But I would like for us to just go a little bit deeper into that and say, what do these coalitions look like? What does the solidarity look like? Who do we build allies with in order to disrupt an agenda that seems to be just really taking us back to the same old social order? Do we insert ourselves, or do we build new conversations, or is it a mix of both?
This is such a this is such a profound question, yes? By the way, I also want to really compliment Tanya for raising this issue of food. It's a slightly different point, but I just want to get it in there because you're so right, Tanya. You're so right. Our global food system is broken. As you say, it's unhealthy, it's ecologically disastrous. And this is a good moment to actually shift away from that. So yes, I completely agree with what you've said. But to go back to your question, Masego, yeah, this is one of those things where I don't think there's a clear blueprint. It's not like do X, Y, Z, and this following thing will happen. You really have to be, I think the point about, especially all of you younger feminists, I'm so delighted with all the energy of these young feminists. Thank you. So, what you have to do is be very flexible and not be doctrinaire. I hate to say this, but let me give you an example of what's happening right now in India. We're having a huge farmers' protest, which was unexpected. The opposition parties didn't plan it. It was kind of spontaneous, and it was a reaction to 3 farm laws that the government brought in, which are designed to favor their cronies and bring in corporate farming and the usual kind of things. It will leave farmers to the mercy of multinational corporations. And these farmers have sussed it out, and they've come, and suddenly it grew and grew and grew. Now, this was not, most of the farmers who came originally are from North India. They're very macho, they're very patriarchal, they have terrible views on feminism, etc., etc. But they were genuinely upset with the government for things which will destroy the livelihood of about half of the Indian workforce. And as they gathered there, they were more and more open to listen to others. Now, when you go to those protest sites, not that I can go, right? I'm anyway in a different part of the world, but the photographs that you see of the protest sites, the people who are coming to talk to them, the kinds of photographs they're displaying, they're talking about the political prisoners, the dissenters being jailed. They're talking about young women students who were protesting against the citizenship laws last year. It's automatically happening that there is a coalescence of forces who feel that this is a government that is basically undemocratic and is, bringing in an authoritarian rule in different ways, and that all of this is designed to further its own corporate cronies. Now, this perception has created a big coalition without any of us sitting there theorizing about how this coalition must include X and Y. But it needs enough people who are flexible enough to say, yes, I'm going to go out there and see what they're saying and see what we have in common. So trade unions are now supporting this. Transport workers are supporting this. Various small industrialists are supporting this. Women's movements are supporting this. Yet it begins from a very different place. So I think what we can see, and this is certainly true in India in my lifetime, change often happens from directions that you don't expect. You don't see it coming. We don't see it coming. We're looking at the obvious suspects. We're looking at our friends and relations and our, people we agree with, and we're saying, oh, why can't we do this and why can't we do that? Somebody else comes and does something. We should be willing and available and flexible enough to be part of that.
Thanks for that, Jayati. That change happens from directions we least expect. Yes. And I'd really like to bring Tanya on board here, and you're absolutely right. She did raise a very fundamental point around reimagining development, also meaning that we have to rethink our food systems and to rethink this notion that food production has to be done for export and sending food out without looking at the needs within our contexts, food sovereignty, access to seeds, and the freedom to choose the seed varieties and so forth. Tanya, I just wanted to bring you on board and just draw as well on your insights to respond to the same question that I asked Professor Jayati around the kinds of coalitions.
You have to cut out the professor every time you say my name. It makes me feel even older than I am.
And each time you talk about us being young, we feel so flattered. We're not as young as we look. We're just energized to be in the presence of such great ideas and the sisterhood that's been driving the festival. So Tanya, just to bring you in there as well around the coalitions, and you bring critical points on agendas that are often forgotten, underplayed, undermined by the big policy machinery. And the important one that you highlighted was around food sovereignty and how we rethink and relook at the production of food systems as, I guess, part of this multicolor vision that we have to be driving towards. And the question for you as well is, what kind of coalitions do we want, do we need to push these agendas forward? And how do we get these ideas to gain traction beyond ourselves? Because in this conversation, we are almost preaching to the converted and sharing ideas about ultimately things that we largely agree on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that very important question. I think definitely these responses to this current moment have to be global for all the reasons that were outlined earlier, and that coalitions are a part of doing that. At the same time, for me at least, I feel that among feminist networks, and particularly South-feminist networks, I feel like if you ask a question around, let's say, sexual and reproductive health and rights, there's a consensus, there's a deep analysis, there's an understanding, and that, but the same has not been done around the macroeconomic issues or issues of trade. So I strongly feel that we have a lot of work to do in the spaces, particularly in the local spaces where we organize, to do that consciousness raising work around the tax justice issues that we're raising, the macroeconomic issues that we're raising, even the climate issues that we're raising, and to build on the knowledge that people have, for example, living on the front lines of extreme weather events annually, and the sort of corporate takeover of lands after disaster that we have seen in the region as well, the disaster capitalists. So I do think that a lot of work to widen the scope of what we consider feminist issues, and to bring and to do the likewise a similar kind of consciousness raising at our community levels as well around all of these things that we were talking about. So food and health and non-communicable disease, etc., trade, tax justice. Just for me, part of the work is having a much broader analysis and understanding that is coming from the people. So I think that coalitions are important, but I also see the ways in which they are areas in which I think that either the feminist voices have been too few, or kind of it has become almost too sort of a specialized kind of knowledge, and that we have to go back to democratizing, the ability of all of us to understand and speak back to particularly economic policies which impoverish the majority of people. And I do think, the idea of these unlikely coalitions, or the ways, so for me, like, labor movements have to also be spaces that are feminist spaces. Just yesterday, I saw ILO Caribbean office, they have a panel on the future of work, and and it's 6 men. And that came on the heels of about 2 weeks ago, a panel that was on a climate report for the Caribbean that was also only men. So we had these 2 back-to-back panels on things that are really, there's no future of anything without women. And there's no excuse to exclude at the highest levels of decision making, of intervention, of policy, a diversity of voices that must include women, but more and more we see that repeated. So I feel like we have to be working on multiple fronts at multiple levels in many different kinds of coalitions. That, you know, we have to recognize that there's work for everybody to do, and that the organizing that happens locally is as important as accessing the larger decision-making spaces, because this is going to create the sort of groundswell that is required to really push any kind of change. So absolutely, we have to be thinking coalitions, we have to be thinking multiple levels, scales, and scope of the kinds of work that we do. And we really need to, I think often feminists get together and we always say, you know, we're preaching to the converted, we're just talking to ourselves. But actually for me, when I come to these spaces, I am learning a tremendous amount. So I may be converted, but I'm also learning a lot from the persons who are living realities similar and different from mine, who are doing, you know, already bringing into being new worlds, working on alternatives. For me, there's a tremendous amount of learning that happens there. And what we need to do is, like, we need to be everywhere and realize that, you know, we gain nothing once and for all. We have to constantly be working just to maintain, just to not lose ground, while at the same time pushing the boundaries and expanding.
Masego and Gabriela, I have to leave now. And also Tanya, I'm really sorry to leave this terrific discussion. And I can see there are lots of very interesting questions in the chat and the Q&A box. So I'm sorry I can't be part of this, but it's really terrific that you guys are doing this. Please keep it up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you
keep
so
in
much.
touch. Absolutely. Bye.
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 So let's keep our conversation here. One thing, there's a question in the question and answers from Neil Angela, which is a very interesting one. How can we intervene in this global Green New Deal conversation, considering these conversations happening mostly in the North? So should we occupy these spaces, or we have one of our own to make the case of social reproduction being at the center of recovering, regulation, redistribution, and reparation? I believe this is an important question for us because historically we have these spaces that are dominated by white cisgender men from the North. And how are we going to organize ourselves to, should we occupy the spaces, or should we created our own spaces like this? And so, Tonya, how we feel about these questions?
Sure, and thanks for the question. No, so absolutely, this notion of a Green Deal, there's no way in which the global South can be considered as outside of that framework, because it will have implications for developing countries, right? If Europe is seeking to reduce their emissions, then they're not seeking to just import, emissions from other countries, or be importing goods that are producing, that are coming from means of production that increase emissions. So therefore, it's a global question. And I think that we do need our spaces where we are advancing our own thinking, but we also need to be aware of how, what these arrangements in the North mean for us in the South. We have a global economy, so there's no way in which any sort of development, any sort of policy development has repercussions for the global South, including repercussions that we can understand as punitive. There's also the way in which the deal may not be ambitious enough. And I think we definitely need to be able to intervene in those spaces, even as we are working autonomously as well on a reimagination that demands a larger, a vision that is a lot more bolder, as opposed to operating within the existing global economic system, but trying to find the ways in which we can ameliorate certain aspects of the environmental degradation while leaving a system intact that ultimately cannot deliver on the kind of climate justice that is required.
Thank you so much. Masego, do you want to make some questions?
I actually would like to invite participants online to also feel free to speak as well, beyond just typing on the chat and your questions on the Q&A. We've got both options available. But Tanya, I mean, what you just said, if I add anything, I'll be just taking away from very powerful insights that you have shared. So instead, I want to read one of the questions as well that is on the channel for you to respond to, and for others online who might want to chip in here. And the question is, what extraordinary measures do developing countries, governments in the WTO, UNFCCC, and other international spaces need to take to win against Northern governments' guardianship to their corporations?
Thank you for that question. That's a very sort of a very cutting question, but I also think it's important for us to recognize the way in which the inequalities inhere in these multilateral structures, and that the multilateralism that we tend to have is one in which favors the global north. And to give an example, if you think of extractive industries and foreign investor protections, where private corporations can actually sue within trade agreements, you have private corporations that can actually sue governments. And the majority of those cases have actually, extractive industries have predominated in those areas, even as we understand how the degradation of extractivism. And so overall, we have to have a policy coherence, which is not that on the one hand, you have these provisions where corporations can sue governments in developing countries, and that is very much linked to extractive industries, where, you know, the question is not just environmental degradation, but also all different kinds of exploitation of labor, of gendered exploitation, exploitation of the poor, as well as the issues around tax justice and capital flight that we have been talking about this morning. So we really have to ensure a kind of a policy coherence, where on the one hand, we are not repeating this emptiness about, you know, trade as this engine of development. And then on the other hand, you also have these mechanisms which are punitive towards countries in the global south, and which deepen structural inequality, even as the one on the other hand, we're talking about, you know, possibilities around for as trade for development, or even the ways in which now gender becomes positioned relative to trade, right? And we talk about, you know, market access for women entrepreneurs, and it almost feels like a ridiculous and contradictory discussion when we think about the inequality that is linked to the rising the growth levels and the inequalities that are engineered, that we're also having this parallel conversation where women get extracted primarily as entrepreneurs, and that mainstreaming and thinking about gender in this area is about thinking about women in entrepreneurship, when that's not where the majority of women workers are at all. And we're often those women entrepreneurs who are meant to be connected to global supply chains are women entrepreneurs in the North. So I think we have to be, you know, the question being posed about thinking about multilateralism and where the points of intervention are, we have to be very clear around the incoherence that exists. And we also have to be clear about how this language of gender continues to be co-opted in ways that are ultimately inimical to the well-being of the majority of the world's peoples.
Tanya, I think you're so absolutely right. And just thinking about multilateralism and how sometimes the policy language that is used to strip away the real power behind what is being discussed, right? And the real agenda around issues that ought to be at the center, like redistribution, reparations, as we have been discussing here. And just going back to the issue of this, the Green Deal and the history of framing the Green Deal, if you think about it within the context of the UN framework on climate change, combating climate change, the earlier years of that treaty were very clear from a reparations point of view. There was language in there that allowed for that discussion to happen. The language of differentiated responsibilities, the language of equity and justice being built into the treaty. But when we look at what has come out recently, none of that is there, right? It's more building on just the notion of common responsibilities and taking away the responsibility of countries and economic systems that are responsible for how we end up with this mess to clean up the mess. And you're absolutely right about the kind of, what terms like gender mainstreaming have done to all of this, women's empowerment, and how, that translates to a very dry technical pathway towards, we're talking about women's entrepreneurship and all of that, all of which strips away the politics and the issues that really are at the heart of the agenda, and almost diverting our attention from having difficult conversations about redistribution. So I think these are really fundamental issues. Tanya, I don't know if there's any other questions that have come up on the Q&A, which I might have missed. I don't want to miss any good questions coming from our panelists, including inputs that are coming through. I'm scrolling through the chat as I speak and failing dismally at multitasking. But I
have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking about how we must address the violence issue, and especially the gender violence in our agenda of development. Since it's a very structured issue that all of us face in all realities we have, how we think about this issue without fail in well, we know about the process of incarceration in mass. We know the process and how we must to touch this agenda. I feel like sometimes inside the feminist movements we have different visions. So I would like to hear about you, Tonya, in the Caribbean reality, how we feel about this issue and how we think about to address this issue. Hello, Nancy.
You know what? We were thinking exactly the same thing, Gabriella. Because my point I wanted to just throw in this question of violence and the intensification of violence, of gender-based violence, violence against women under the neoliberalism, and the fact that this is going to be the outlet for, it's being used as the outlet for frustrations. It's not to, take away responsibilities from anybody, but really there are two things that I think there's a lot of, there's been huge strikes or protests, both, I think in Southern Africa at least, of total shutdowns because of just the most horrendous types of violence against women and girls, and the fact that it's become too much, and needing to think about even the Women's Global Strike campaign, and looking at that and connecting that to say, you know, this violence, which is structural, is also coming from this capitalist patriarchy in its most extreme and vicious sense, and it's going to continue, and we really have to mobilize, because it's our lives that are at stake. Well, they were always at stake, but I think it's really alarming to think about what's coming up next if we don't solve these problems.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Nancy, and thank you, Gabriella, for posing that question and for returning, you know, putting that question of violence on the table. So I want to say, for me, it's impossible to think that you can devalue the kind of work, for example, that is primarily done by women within a context of neoliberal approaches to governance, within a context of structural adjustment. You cannot devalue women and women's labor in that way and not expect violence against women. We absolutely have to see the ways in which these two things are connected. The sort of invisible labor of women that underwrites the economy, and that when it is paid is very poorly paid. We have to make that connection as well to gender-based violence and to violence against women, and also to the ways in which our economies are engineered for exclusion, for racial exclusion, class exclusion, and the gender-based discrimination. So that's on the one hand, right? But on the other hand, I think it's also important for us as feminists to recognize that, you know, there is violence against women that is outside of that as well, right? That even if we were to work towards a much more just economic system that was inclusive, you will still see a manifestation of violence against women, because we have misogyny at the root, which we need to address. And for me, I felt today, the 16 days of activism ended yesterday, and I felt very, you know, I felt almost as though it was an annual exercise in which women and girls got platitudes as well as unhelpful advice from the highest places, including from the sort of state and police mechanisms that Gabriella mentioned, you know, having alternatives outside of the police, but you know, that, you know, what the police are able to offer in the events where you have a girl being killed is, you know, unhelpful advice to girls themselves about, you know, use your intuition, don't smile at men. And so for me, I think absolutely we have to have that structural analysis. I see Amina ma'am in the chat saying that neoliberalism is intrinsically violently gendered and militarized. And I think we absolutely have to have that analysis, hold that analysis at the same time of thinking about how we do have misogyny outside of capitalism, you know, outside of coloniality, and be working on addressing those simultaneously. So for me, in many ways this week, I felt very, very frustrated about the ways in which, you know, everything is more important than women and girls, including the way in which the conversation around men as allies is being framed, and the creation of spaces for men to bask in their misogyny is then being recast as somehow part of efforts to address violence against women. So I think, you know, I think we have to have an analysis that is seeing multiple kinds of systems and structures that are complicit and coalescing and working together to, you know, in many ways make violent death of women be something that, you know, as much as we're struggling with cancers, with diabetes, that when it comes to thinking about what shortens women's life expectancy, it is often men's violence against us.
Thanks for that, Tanya. I think one of the questions that is coming up in the chat, I think it is again one from Amina, where she makes the point that neoliberalism is intrinsically violently gendered and militarized. But how do we get out from this entrapment? And she says, we've been analyzing this for decades, and I'm seeing a call here for withdrawing women's labor. Women must go on a global strike, and when women stop, the world stops. And I guess in a way it answers that question about what more do we do? You know, what else do we need to do beyond analyzing and really drawing attention to this problem of violence against women and the different layers of how violence against gender-based violence plays out. The violence that is meted on women because of a system that you rightfully said that is misogynistic, and you know, what are the solutions around that? I think there's been a lot of insights and ideas that have been coming up in the you know, throughout the festival. What I would like us to do is to have a conversation, and I think this is one of the central questions, and it ties to what has been asked: what to do next? What do we do? And it's really a question on how do we go about reviving debates at the national level as a challenge to neoliberalism. It's great that we come together in a festival like this. It is great that we are fighting for space to engage at the multilateral level, at the global level. But what do we do to energize the discussions and the engagement that needs to be taking place at a national level? And just to tie it to one of the questions that has been asked, and this one specifically around the Green Deal, is that we need a thorough interrogation of the Green New Deal and an articulation of a multicolored one with added colors, right? Who will do this? And how do we go about finding South feminists to do this? I think coming out of this festival, we now have a long list of South feminists who can do this and who are already doing it. But yeah, those are the questions. How do we revive national level debates and energize at that level?
Thank you. And I also saw one question that requested a question about colonialism and the gender binary and what the connection is there.
Okay.
So all of I think for me, the question about, you know, how do we energize the debate at a national level? I think already, you know, something like this South Feminist Festival should energize everybody who gets to participate to also take things back to the spaces where they operate locally. For me, that has to be the other part of these South feminist gatherings, has to also be that you are constantly taking things back to your local spaces, to national spaces, and doing that work. So I don't know that I have an answer to that question that you don't already have, or that persons who are on the call don't already have, about how to do that national level and that local level mobilizing. I think the other question was about colonialism and the gender binary, was one that I saw in the Q&A box. Did you have another question, Masejo?
No, those are just the two questions that have come up. There's one more that has come up, which is it says here that I'm wondering if we can't form feminist cooperative services against violence and industries as a response. but yeah, those were the last questions that have come through the chat.
Okay. So women's cooperatives as a response to violence, and also the other question about gender binaries and colonialism.
Yeah.
For me, I'll take the gender and colonialism question. I'm from Barbados, and Cecilia Green has some lovely historical scholarship on women's labor in Barbados. And one of the things that she demonstrates in her work is the way in which Black women in Barbados and Black working women in Barbados, the way in which any sort of normative understanding of gender operated in a way that was always punitive. So whether it was that on the one hand, Black women were positioned outside of these norms of gender, and their labor was exploited, productive, reproductive, sexual labor exploited, but that when the colonial government sought to, in many ways, reimpose a kind of a normative understanding of gender, it did it in ways that were contradictory. So to give a concrete example, we have the period where there is a lot of out-migration of Barbadians to Panama to build the canal. And during that period, women's rates of prison going actually outstripped men's. Which is unprecedented now. If you know, you don't even have to know a lot about prisons to know that you don't expect that women are going to them at higher rates than our men. And the colonial thinking at the time was that, well, these women, men are migrating in large numbers. And so these women are now got recast as abandoned, right? They're abandoned and outside of patriarchal control. And the way to address these so-called abandoned women was with incarceration, right? And so for me, that made it very clear that any notion of traditional relations of gender in the Caribbean is a myth, right? But also that any attempts to reimpose a sort of binary normative relations of gender along a Western bourgeois kind always mean violence for women, are always contradictory for Black women, even as women may strategically use their space outside. Black women may use their space outside of these normatives for their own creativity and etc. For me, it's very clear that the race inheres for us in the region is inherent to the construction of unequal relations of gender and inseparable. And so impossible for me to think about unequal relations of gender and not also think about how they are racialized and how they are very much embedded in white supremacist anti-Black logics. So for me, there's never a sort of a nostalgia for any sort of normative, heteronormative relations of gender, particularly because I understand the violence that Black women face being outside of what was considered feminine, but also the violence that they did face when all of a sudden these normative relations of gender were sought to be imposed, right? And I hope that has been clear and that I have, through that example, been able to clarify that question. And I will just say, so I see the last question around feminist cooperatives. And I do think that we need as much feminist action and activism and mobilizing in all of the different spaces we occupy by a range of, women, queer and trans people, non-binary people, working in different modes of organizing at different levels and different scales and scopes. I think we need to abandon the idea that we have either any sort of charismatic leadership or that it has to come from a particular location, but that really we need everybody, we need all hands at work where this is concerned.
Well, Tanya, Lots of great points there. I just want to invite Gabriella, just check if she's got any other questions before we wrap up.
I also just to say that I don't necessarily need questions. I'm also I like to be in dialogue
yeah,
in dialogue
exactly.
rather than to feel like I have to have the answer. I want to say like I don't have any answers.
No, but I like a lot your reflections. I want to thank you very, very much to share with us, because we are talking about issues that we all facing in the local realities, and it's really important for us to be able to have this space for thinking in a macro way, to see international perspectives. In most of space, we have the chance to exchange our experiences. It's by the eyes of the international organization. So it's really important that we have this space with our you see, independence and the freedom of our thoughts. So I really, really wanna just thank you. And the struggle, it's the freedom is a constant struggle. So it's really important to have you all side by side, because we are going to build the future we want together. We have Harriet here. I think she wants to make some appointment. Feel free to speak, Harriet.
Yeah.
Hi, it's good to see you all.
Hi, Harriet. Thank you for joining us. We're just wrapping up and then inviting you to say something about yourself and to share with us the 4 pieces, the poetry that you've got prepared to share with us today.
Awesome.
Thank you. So I think, colleagues, this has been a really great, fascinating, nourishing, and enriching conversation. And I think, as Tonya said, to the question about space and whether when we convene this way, we are preaching to the converted, the point that she makes about the importance of the festival being a space for us to learn from each other and to draw energy from each other is an important one. And the importance of maintaining these sacred spaces as spaces for nourishment and as spaces for ideation is critical, and has come out quite strongly in the interventions by Gabriella, by Jayati, by Tonya, and by all of you in your comments. And Nancy, Letu, colleagues, I hope that we are also keeping record of the rich comments and the links that have been shared here, so that we don't lose them. But in this conversation about how we reimagine development and the role of South feminists, I think you would agree with me that from this conversation, we do see that a multicolored future is a possibility, particularly if it is one that is driven by us. And we've been clear about what that multicolored deal or multicolored future could look like, and the important nuggets of it, including where and with whom we can build alliances with, the issues that we mustn't lose sight of. Food sovereignty being at the top of the agenda, questions around intellectual property rights in the so-called post-COVID recovery, and how we build alliances with some of the emerging movements and discourse around the people's vaccine and so forth. The relevance of cross-border and financial flows, the regulation of markets, and how that becomes a feminist agenda. But also, I think what was happening here is a process of also debunking some of the mainstream economic thinking that we largely have. And I liked what came out around this whole notion of our the capability and the capacity of our states to provide the responses that are needed to move the needle in the direction that benefits women and benefits other marginalized groups. This whole notion about the politics behind we don't have the resources and therefore we should go out and borrow and so forth. The debt agenda, the trade liberalization agenda, paying attention to cross-border financial flows, and a whole lot of other issues that were shared with us. I think what was really important as well is the idea that we have to look at the entire system as a whole and understand the politics that are taking place in the debates about ecosystem collapse and environmental sustainability, what is happening around social transformation and the discourse that is gaining traction around the kind of politics that will deliver for us all. I would really like to thank Jayati in her absence and to thank Tonya as well for coming on board and sharing insights with us, and my co-facilitator, Gabriela, and then to invite Harriet to take us into an artistic offering. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I have a recording of poems that I sent earlier, and I'll just introduce them. So the collection of poems I shared speak to a world where economic and social and particularly power dynamics have changed in favor of women. So in one of the poems, for instance, I rewrite the creation story in a way that, for instance, women are created first and men are created from women's ribs. So I do that in my writing to try and normalize the different demands that women make, the different advocacies that women are making, and the different spaces that women are trying to occupy. So that is generally the overall theme that runs through most of the poems that I shared. So I hope you enjoy them.
Hi, my name is Harriet Anena. I am a Ugandan writer. I'm going to recite 4 poems, and the first one is titled Red Paint. Words retreat beneath my tongue when you open the front door. I serve you my body even before you ball a fist. Your hands gift me wings and I fly, daring the ceiling, returning to a floor glistering with red paint. My body long mastered the tune your feet make whenever they touch face, or teeth, or throat, or tummy, or ribs, or spine. But today, I toss my bones at your chest and watch you fly and return to earth as a piece of messed up art. I'm closing the front door now, leaving behind a stream, crimson. The second poem is titled The Things We Choose to Forget. We kept history asleep for years, grateful for the stillness that replaced the pounding in our bones. Our minds did well, killing the things our ears forgot to block, like the voices that told fathers, we will make you women, which also meant we will make you non-human, which also meant we will desecrate your dignity. We latch onto imposed normalcy, willing our minds to make no resurrections for things we refuse to call memory, like how deep they dug gullies into our flesh, like how fast we flowed with red, like how hard we felt pain until it was nothing. We have come so far, but our bodies refuse to recall that they were once guitars strummed by bullets. The third poem is titled Malaya. And the latecomers found no remnants of softness. Now I peel myself open before their hands do the yanking. I make sure my eyes say nothing as I serve flesh before it's claimed. They too know that this body is a walk-in. Strangers pay by mere possession of manhood. Then they leave, calling me Malaya, like it takes just one person to become a slut. The book of Genesis, according to her, in our creation story, we sculpture man from our ribs and watch him spend years contorting. We never worry he will break from the pursuit of unreachable beauty. And it transcends the body, the shrinking to keep societal water unturbulent, speaking pruned, countable words, tiptoeing everywhere so that no egg of power gets cracked. We won't be making any vagina soft for anybody. In our creation story, we didn't create any manhood already stiff. Yes.
Thank you, Harriet. That was just beautiful.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And as Nancy says, we will reimagine development. We have no choice. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And yeah, there is a closing session. Nancy, perhaps you can share details on that quickly before we all go offline.
Thank you, Tonya. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you for your time and for sharing such a value thoughts with us. We are in this together, and I thank technology for connecting us in these hard times. It's a hug to be with your side, sister. So thank you very much.
So just that our last session will be on, it's what next? We started sort of introducing ourselves. So those of us who are sort of in the organizing group, it'll be a final session. It's what next for 2021. We would also really like to acknowledge in a more sort of formal and compact way the people who have worked really hard to get this South Feminist Futures Festival moving in quite quick turnaround times. And so that will be starting, that will be starting in the 30 minutes after we close. So we hope that everybody will join us. It will be our last session. It's just a celebration of ourselves, what we've been able to achieve collectively. And it's been a lot, more than any single one person could put together. But there's been, such a huge effort. So we would like to have that. I think Claire Matonzi will facilitate us. Some of us are going to take a bit of a back seat. that will be the last session for the festival. Please come and join us. Before we end, to say goodbye. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe. One love.
Yay, one love. See you in 15 minutes or 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for the privilege of being here. Thank you.